Hello, everyone. My name is Colton Gilbert. I am the topic author for criminal justice reform, the 2020-2021 high school policy debate topic. I wanted to post this for a few reasons. I know that a lot of times people go to debate camps and they go there for instruction, intros to the topic. And I also know that because of the way the world is situated, that obviously was not accessible for a lot of people. But also I know that debate camps, because of their nature, are inaccessible to a lot of people that they would be beneficial to if they were accessible to those people. So I wanted to provide my services or my expertise, as you will, for the general public. Because I think criminal justice reform is something that we should be talking about, something that's important, it's relevant. And with that being said, there are just some top level things that I just want to get out. And so I've given myself a time limit here, and in true debater fashion, I have my timer. So I think the first thing that I want to talk about is, as a community, when the paper first came out or when the voting first came out, people were upset that the paper was the topic. People railed about it online in various websites or forums and said that there was no net ground and the topic paper was terrible and who voted for it, this, that, and the third. And, it was interesting, to see all of this before summer of 2020 happened. So those of you that may have said that, I'm sure at some point metaphorically had your foots in your mouth. Because in all, we see that after all the debate camps have happened, we see that there's a lot of room to debate this topic. We see that a lot of the resistance to the topic was probably rooted in forms of anti-Blackness, even in the editing and writing. Before I turned it in, the first edits, people essentially told me that this would devolve into All Lives Matter versus Black Lives Matter or Blue Lives Matter. And I quite frankly did not care, because I think that for too long, the situation of America has shown us that we as a country are too unwilling to address the elephant in the room, too unwilling to address the elephant in the room. And I think furthermore, as a debate community, for so long, we have recycled topics that, they are educational, Chinese engagement, the year before the criminal justice paper, I wrote the Middle East paper. So, I think that, there are places where we are guilty of it. We want to always find ways to debate, things like climate change. Shout out to Dustin Remy, a good friend of mine. We have these types of topics. You also have international engagement topics, whether it's China or Latin America. Russia was a paper a few years ago, recurs every once in a while. And so we have found ourselves debating cycles, and as a community refuse to have these conversations. The reasons why a lot of teams, that are big on the TLC circuit make the argument that debate is accessible for Black people because there are UDLs. So, I mean, does that mean that the only types of debate that Black people should be doing are UDL debates? And does it also imply that minority debaters shouldn't be having conversations about, in those TLC circles, those national style circles? I don't think so. And in case you're wondering, my shirt says free-ish since 1865. But I think that more importantly, the bigger issue is the inability for us as a community to come on one accord. We have certain racial antagonisms that exist that we refuse to acknowledge. And I think that this topic is a good way to force our hands and show in a lot of ways that, we're not the community we project ourselves to be to mainstream people. And I have about 50 seconds left on the 4 minutes I gave myself on this top level framing stuff. But I just want to say that not having this conversation would have been detrimental to us. But let's not pat ourselves on the back and say we want to, we were progressive and we were in the right direction when the topic came out, because we were resistant as a community to the topic. You were resistant as a community to the topic. And so let's not take this with a grain of salt. And the last thing that I want to say is, it's very odd that a person who's been teaching for going into my 8th year now can't get a job at debate camps. You know, I'm qualified. You can look up my judge record on Tab Room that I've applied it to the camps around the country to essentially be told, you know, that's time, to essentially be told that I wasn't good enough, staff was full, even though I knew staff was full because I wasn't full, because I knew people who worked at those camps. There was one program in particular I would like to explicitly exclude from my indict, and that is the Jayhawk Debate Institute. Shout out to them, they're awesome. But everyone else everyone else where I applied and you did not want to hire me, shame on you. Also, shout out to the Washington Urban Debate League, who decided to hire me 2 years in a row now, and gave me the opportunity to do what I do, and let me coach the varsity lab this year. So if you see how we did the camp tournament, yeah, you see the ballot count. So with that being said, we're going to get into the nitty gritty. I'm going to take over the screen here, and we're just going to keep it going. So yeah, I have been the Arkansas delegate for topic selection for about, excuse me, 6, maybe 7 years. And this will be my first year on the wording committee, so this will be interesting. And so being a topic author for 2 years and now being on the wording committee, I have some access. And the one thing that I will say is that a lot of people complain about the topics and a lot of states didn't vote. And so I just want to remind everyone that elections have consequences. And if you don't like the papers that get proposed, how about you write one, come to topic selection and do your part. We'd love to have you. So my relation to the topic, you know, this is a perfect topic for debaters. I felt like for years, we've had topics that didn't really speak to the debaters, you know? And so I wanted to incorporate, I feel like this is a topic where we can incorporate more anecdotal evidence, not necessarily to say that like narratives matter more than other things, but that on these type of topics, your social location matters a lot more than say, you know, other topics. Now, education and, immigration were great in giving people a social location, but everybody has an access point from which they can speak to or about criminal justice reform. And so, these are things. And so I just want you all to think about, now I will open source this project, this website, this presentation. So you'll be able to see a few things and, the links and stuff here. But number 3, you definitely want to check out. But I remember being racially profiled and being told that, you know, I didn't, I fit the description of somebody, and I knew I didn't. And so as a Black man in America, I knew that we needed to have this conversation. And funny story, my mother, may she rest in peace, she told me one of the jokes in our family, because my name is Colton Gilbert, and one of the jokes is they don't know I'm Black till I get to the interview, which is pretty funny. And also, which is sad to have to be a joke in the family in America, that if people knew that I was Black, you know, that decreases my chances of, you know, access to things. And so I knew that me being Black, even at a young age in high school, could be, you know, problematic in terms of putting me in a position to with the police. And so summer 2020, I mean, there's no way, you know, having, you know, defended the paper last summer, flying straight from the Washington Urban Debate League camp straight to Chicago and defending it there. Never could have guessed what would happen with 2020 with Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, the social protests, and everything. You know, no way we could have predicted this, which means that we are on the right track as a community. And this is a perfect moment for us to not waste it and embrace it. And so these arguments about there's no net ground, this, that, and the third, this is a topic I'm going to tell y'all where no matter what style of debate you do, you can really flex your muscles on this topic. And we're going to talk about that. And so for this one, we're just going to discuss the affirmative side, just kind of like an intro to the topic. The next video will be straight negation. So resolved, the United States federal government should enact substantial criminal justice reform in the United States in one or more of the following: forensic science, policing, sentencing. And so we're going to dissect it in specific areas, and then I'll give you some pointers. But first, we must go back and think about exactly where does modern day policing come from. And one of the first places where we understand policing today is the Fugitive Slave Act. You know, and passed the first iteration in 1850, was part of the compromise. And it said that, you know, slaves had to be returned to their owners, you know, not people, property, slaves that look like me, my ancestors, that happened to make it, excuse me, from the ships, from there's, we'll get into that. And so they were, even if they were in the free state, they had to be returned back to their slave owners. And so this is where we understand where policing and those types of things happen. But also the people that make arguments about, well, the federal government isn't in policing or has never done things. This is probably one of the first iterations of seeing the federal government taking action in what we understand is like policing or law enforcement, right? And this is in 1850. So we have to think about, what do we understand as policing and what in terms of the topic. So we have the Fugitive Slave Act, and that happens. And so we move on. And so after the Civil War, the 13th Amendment happens. And we have the link here for Black codes that'll be available for you. And we see how the 13th Amendment outlawed slavery, and people point to that. But what they fail to understand is it outlawed slavery except in the context of imprisonment. So what that allowed states to do was enact the first round of what we saw in Reconstruction, the early Jim Crow laws, or what we saw to be codified later as Jim Crow laws, where there were essentially laws to police Black folks, essentially we see Black people loitering, we're going to arrest them laws, things like this. And I'm not really a huge fan of Wikipedia, but it has its merits. And so for those of you that want a quick, succinct synopsis of Black codes and what they were, if this is foreign to you, I have that listed here for you at the bottom, and this will be open source for you as well. And so, this is where here in Reconstruction, we see how certain ways to police bodies and individuals gets implemented. One of the first reasons that marijuana became illegal in our country, people don't realize, is that reefer madness, the idea that people were scared that Black and brown bodies, Black people and Hispanic people specifically, would smoke marijuana or reefer and then go out and take advantage of, sexually assault pure white women, quote unquote. And so what we have is that scare was then codified into law and was used as a way to police minority individuals, incarcerate them, so then they could be enslaved. So then the 13th Amendment was applicable on the Black back end in terms of how slavery could be done. And so this is how we need to understand the police state and the carceral state. So now we can hit the fast forward button in time in America. And there's a lot of things I skipped here. And we can go to the 1994 Crime Bill. Now, this is where we see, excuse me for a moment, this is where we see one of the first recent instances of the federal government injecting themselves into criminal justice system. And it was unprecedented for what it did at the time. And I'm not going to cite all these things here, but you see 1 through 6. But one of the things that I want to highlight here is that the initiation of boot camps for delinquent minors was definitely something that hit minority communities more, they hit minority communities harder than it did, white communities. Now, even number 4, the Violence Against Women Act, that has been reinterpreted so narrowly that there's much little funding than what was previously allocated in terms of percentages. And the creation of the death penalty statutes is important because there were a lot more reasons that the federal government could kill someone than before. And it was part of this like tough on crime law and order that we've seen Trump kind of like reimpose here. And eliminating higher education for inmates is important too, right? Because I think that is an area of sentencing that is a little dicey, right? Exactly what is sentencing? Is it just a sentence, or could sentencing also include possibly certain types of things that happen while a person is incarcerated, right? Which means that like those types of apps, which may like end solitary confinement, could be fringe type apps, depending on how you interpret that portion of the topic. So now we fast forward to the First Step Act. And a lot of the provisions in the First Step Act were actually negotiated under the Obama presidency on the back end. It was renamed and Trump and a few celebrities, got it passed. And what we see is that it was called the First Step Act for a reason, because it openly acknowledges that there are more things that need to happen. And that is the question that the topic begs us this year, is what should we do now that we have taken that first step? And that is the answer that affirmatives that is a question that affirmatives are asked to answer this year. And in a lot of ways, it was a very toothless bill in part because the ways in which it can be narrowly interpreted. And we'll get into that. So what exactly does reform look like? Okay, what should it look like? What would it look like under the topic? And so there are some ways in which you can tie federal dollars to programs, tech incentives, and or incentives for policies. Obama ordered a review of and found that there was a lot of federal dollars that just got wasted because there was little to no oversight. And so a lot of times what those departments would do is they had money that they had to spend it or not get it the next year. There was no oversight for the program. So then they would just overspend it on militaristic equipment and access to those types of things and training with like Navy SEALs and that kind of stuff that costs. And they'll be able to pay for those types of training and equipment. And so a lot of this money was spent without accountability. And so that is kind of a way where you can kind of like think about what reform may or may not or could look like. So what agent, because we always talk about USFG, is it one actor, is it all three actors? There is a very good argument this year about is it all three? Should you actually isolate which branch of the government? Obama wrote a very interesting article, and it's cited for you here, that talks about how the president can unilaterally do things with respect to criminal justice reform and also things that could coincide with like Congress. And I won't explain that to you. He explains it in way better detail than I could ever attempt to. But Congress has also set some precedent here as well, right? We've referenced the 94 crime bill. And technically, if you want to get technical, the Fugitive Slave Act to a lot of ways. But there is also a very, very striking argument to be made that the courts are uniquely positioned to make change this year. A lot of things that we have in the criminal justice system, we owe to the courts. The Brady Doctrine, the idea that if you are faced with a crime or you are prosecuted with a crime and the prosecution has, or the state has evidence that would exonerate you or prove your innocence, they are required to turn that over to your defendant. To your attorney, your defense attorney. That comes out of the Brady Doctrine and handing over exculpatory evidence, right? How we understand Miranda rights when we watch, shows, which I can't stand, Law and Order and things like that, which glorify policing, but we see them read people their rights. You have the right to remain silent. You have the right to an attorney, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That comes from a case where, I'm pretty sure an immigrant was unaware that they were being arrested, had been read their rights, didn't understand what that meant, said some things that probably got them, in trouble. And it was challenged all the way up to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court said, no, that is invalid. What they said should not be allowed because they didn't understand their rights. And so you understanding exactly what it means to be under arrest is because of a court decision, right? So there are a lot of arguments to be made about who is uniquely positioned in the government or which branch is uniquely positioned in order to enact change. And so I think for negatives, one of the good things to just kind of keep in your back pocket is a nice agent counter plan. Get real good on the agent counter plan debate, and having a strategy for specific agents, and we'll get into that on the negative debate, but that's just something to hold your bookmark there and we'll come back to. So let's just dissect the topic. We'll start with enact. Now, I was not on the wording committee when the topic was worded. I just proposed an area, and I did not want the word enact in the resolution. You got to make concessions, I guess, in life. And one of the things that I was concerned with in the wording committee as they were making this argument, and I didn't voice it as well, and I don't think it really matters at this point, is that enact generally implies legislation. So for a lot of K teams that don't read, that read planless apps, I think the wording committee inadvertently gave those framework or TUSFG teams a little bit more traction than probably they would have gotten in past years, solely because that word enact is in the resolution. But there was almost no other middle ground for us to make there. But that also sets up a very good argument for negative teams about why specifically that implies if legislation, that could mean that like court action and executive action is in that ground. That is one way to interpret it. But enact, enact could also mean in the context of the resolution, enact has to be something that builds upon something that is pre-existing. So like enact reform, enact criminal justice reform, you could make the argument that creating something brand new on a topic that is so large, especially when you think about forensic science, policing, sentencing, is essentially 3 topics mashed into one, and allowing affirmative teams to just create things out of thin air might not be the best thing for negative ground. So in that context, over limiting might be better, because if you under limit what the enactment portion of it is, i.e. you can enact brand new things that were never thought of or don't have a literature basis, that probably is not good for negative teams. And so I think that these are places where the interpretation of the topic can play a big deal in terms of, are you topical or not, or what kind of ground or model of debate does that look like? In criminal justice reform, one of the bigger questions here is that like the affirmative or the topic is bi-directional. And yes, it is. And I don't think that's a problem. I think that as the affirmative, you can use that to your advantage. That essentially justifies some apps where you could isolate an issue where you think we under incarcerate people for, or you think the punishments are not severe enough. And so you can say, well, we think that we should increase the penalties for that. And technically that is a reform of the system. Sure, but most apps will look to remedy a wrong that the system has created. And so this can be broad reaching. And I think this is what heightened a lot of people's fears, allegedly, with the topic. That and a lot of people that voted didn't know the author was Black, LOL. But abolition is probably more than likely negative ground. And I know people may end up possibly transcribing this and cutting this as a card. So here's what I'll also say for the underlined and highlighted portions, is that I think abolition can be topical in some ways. If you abolish the death penalty and the system overall still stays in place, that abolition of one portion of the system probably is an overall structural reform to the criminal justice system, right? So that probably means that you are topic or core of the topic, and you can make those types of arguments. Additionally, I think that the affirmatives that say we should abolish ICE, I do not think those are untopical, because I think that the abolition of an entire branch of the system is in and of itself a reform. Why? Because I think affirmatives have ground to argue that in abolishing ICE, that requires the other parts of the government to operate possibly more independently, differently, right? Which will then create structural changes that is in and of itself a reform. Now that begs the question, is that effectually topical? Is that extra topical? Those are debates to be had, right, by the students. Excuse me. Okay, so some cool arguments. And I alluded to one of these earlier about reform, about reform not being, it can't be new. But I think one other one that I've seen is, teams have these arguments where they're like, we should over police the KKK or things like that. And I think that those are cool apps, but I don't know if that is completely topical, because there are arguments to be made that if you are essentially saying the government, the 1AC is essentially a concession that says the government has these laws that they don't enforce now. And we will concede that there were certain FBI reports that warned us in 2015, 2011, way back in the 2000s, late 2010s, that alt-right and right-wing extremists had infiltrated law enforcement, and we did nothing about it. And now we're going to pass an act that essentially enforces existing laws more stringently on the cops that are supposed to enforce the laws, on the racist cops that are policing, right? I think there are a lot of arguments to suggest as why that is bad for negative ground. And that is a place where I think negatives can get traction in terms of what actual reform is. Right. And I think that also calls into question like philosophical interpretations of the topic. Maybe in this day and age, our interpretation of the topic should not include refocusing the debate on policing alt-right and right-wing extremists. Maybe we should center the debate about the over-policing of marginalized groups, and about how then that can tangentially lead to getting rid of the problematic or racist cops that don't want to enforce those laws, maybe, right? Those are the types of conversations. So I think in terms of like what reform should look like, or what the aim of reform should look like, those kind of critical teams can kind of get traction there. Because I think teams that kind of that just say, you know, most people, when you think of criminal justice reform, are like, oh yeah, like the system is messed up towards non-white individuals, non-white male individuals, non-white, non-binary individuals, right? And so I think that those arguments are compelling when coupled with those types of interpretations that says when you've over-focused the debate on policing the white people and policing those types of bodies, why that refocuses a conversation that we should be having from a conversation that we should be, i.e., we should be talking about how this affects marginalized bodies. All right. So, getting ahead of myself. All right. Forensic science. So looking at a lot of the camps, and yes, I've intentionally done this after I've seen a lot of what the camps have put out, is that this seems like a very underutilized portion of the topic. And so if you were looking to write some areas or some arguments post-camp, this is a ripe area to start. You know, it's the lightest portion of the paper. I'll give you that. I'm sure that upset some people. But traditionally, forensic science involves physical evidence, okay? And a lot of experts would agree. And the one reason why facial recognition could fall in that category is that it is the collection of the image of your physical face. And that is why that is considered to be physical evidence. I'm not an expert, but based on my readings of what I've seen in the topic, that is what I've come to understand why facial recognition could fall under forensic science. But other electronic data collection efforts might not, right? So there's some evidence to suggest that forensic science would not include data evidence gathering, i.e. like FISA warrants, or it could not include certain types of FISA warrants. It also may not include the ways in which we access data or metadata and things like that. But some links for probing, which I have listed here for you on the left-hand column. But some affirmatives where I think you can talk about and have a lot of arguments or conversations is post-conviction DNA testing. There are some states, I think Texas is one of them, where we have executed innocent people, where people were convicted with DNA evidence. Well, if they had DNA evidence, how did they get convicted of a crime, Colton? I'm glad you asked. The reason is that in these states, if the state does not want to test the DNA evidence because they have to pay for it, they can choose not to. And if the defendant does not have the capital or the money to pay for that, then that means that it will not get tested. And so a lot of people that face these capital crimes a lot of times don't have access to attorneys that can afford that. And so what ends up happening is that the evidence doesn't get tested. So they can reference the hairs that were found at the crime scene, but they don't have to test the hairs at the crime scene. And what we found is that people have been executed, and then when their DNA was tested against, post their death, when their DNA was tested against the hair samples, they found out that it didn't match. And this person that they just killed was never at the crime scene. And in fact, in one case, the hair that was found at the crime scene belonged to the victim, not the person that was convicted of the crime and subsequently sentenced to death, right? And so that's an area where you can explore. Review boards. Trump, when he first got into office, one of the first things he did was kill the funding and gut the funding for one of the national review boards. And at the time, forensic scientists across the country were asking for certification and accountability standards because there were a lot of questions about what was and what was not forensic science and what was not acceptable, right? 20, 30, 40 years ago, we accepted bite mark and arson types of investigations to be groundbreaking, cutting-edge science that we now understand to be debunked and were too simplistic at the time the analysis was. But that simplistic analysis was used to convict individuals, right? And so I think that the places where you can go there are far and wide-reaching in terms of certification standards, what is and what is not currently. What do we understand in terms of what is forensic science that could be down the line we could find out is actually quite junk science, though, the way in which we understood bite mark analysis 30 years ago. The admissibility of eyewitness testimony is something that's interesting, right? Because I think that's something that not a lot of people have had discussions about, but could possibly fall under certain interpretations of forensic science. And specifically, what does that mean in terms of should they be admissible or not, right? Traffic cameras is a good one. Facial recognition databases, predictive policing algorithms, that we'll get to that on the next few slides. The processing kits of sexual harassment, from sexual assault survivors. Note that I use the word survivors intentionally. We want to understand why is it that there's a backlog of these types of cases, and the policy, I guess, you know, the policy that the policies that those the policies that exist, the messages that those policies send to those groups of individuals, the sexual assault survivors. I think there is something to be said about why that is just functionally wrong, and there should be something done with that. Forget however much it costs. Maybe we should just process each and every one of those and find out and constantly run those against databases. As a negative, you have arguments as to why that may or may not be a good model of accessing and using forensic science. Those are really good debates that we can have there. Policing, okay? This has been probably going to be at the end of the year, considered probably one of the more over-debated portions of the topic. And I don't think that's a problem. Police brutality has, you know, existed since our country's inception. You know, cross-apply the Fugitive Slave Act from above. Cross-apply the 1994 Crime Bill from above. Cross-apply Reconstruction era from above. And so I think that one thing that we need to think about here is that why do we place all of society's ills and problems at the feet of police? And I am far from a sympathizer of police officers. I have friends that are police officers. I have friends that once worked in a prosecutor's office. And so I have more access to understanding how people feel on that side of the law. But one thing that we need to understand is, why do we ask police officers to do so much in our country? No matter how you feel about police officers or policing, that is a very valid question that we probably should address in debating this topic at some point throughout the year. Is that why do we ask so much of police officers? Maybe we should reinterpret what the idea of policing is, possibly. Once again, few places here to your left. And so some affirmatives that we've seen, some things that you can think about, ending the idea of qualified immunity. You know, a police officer shoots someone in the IE, you know, during their duties, the course of their job, you know, then they can't be sued for it. You know, if I'm a school teacher, you know, if a kid upsets me in my classroom and I just decide that I want to smack them across the face because my job is so stressful and they made me feel like it was life or death, me or that student, that 6'1" student looking at me who's just 5'6", 5'7". No, they ain't gonna go for that. I can get sued by that student's parents. So there's a lot of evidence to suggest that maybe having that immunity over emboldens police officers to commit heinous acts. You know, predictive policing algorithms. There are certain cities, Little Rock, I think, may be one of them, in which predictive policing algorithms are used to try to predict which areas of the city need to have higher concentrations of police officers. We have police body cameras, you know, the George Floyd death. Today is August 3rd at the recording of this video, and we just got access, what was made public, the video of his body camera footage. How long has it been since he had died before the body camera footage came out? Right, the idea that even if body cameras work, if you're the negative, I think even if body cameras work, does it actually change police behavior? Or when the evidence actually does come out, will it come out in a time for it to quote unquote matter? Right, these are the types of conversations we can have. The militarization of police, the 1033 program, the surplus program, where school districts have qualified. A school district in Detroit, in LA, have qualified for things like bomb dispersal robots, body armor, M16s. A small college about the size, I think it's called Red River Tech, I might be mistaken, in Northeast Arkansas, qualified for a Surface C-23 cargo airplane through the 1033 program, right? School districts. And a lot of the 1033 program under Trump has gone to ICE and immigration enforcement and Customs and Border Patrol for ICE raids and things like that. So the over-militarization of police is also something we could be addressing here. You know, decriminalization of drugs, ending, stopping, frisk. One thing that, you know, you could tie money and funding, you know, increase funding, maybe provide police incentives for lethal force, you know, give incentives for police departments that have lower instances of use of force, you know, give them monetary incentives or other types of incentives, things like that. Sentencing. This is a hotly debated portion of the topic for sure. You know, some would argue trial attorneys have too much discretion in deciding what to charge and the types of sentence recommendations. You know, there are some departments, some prosecutorial departments that overcharge defendants to force them into a plea deal. that sometimes are terrible, right? Mandatory minimums. I was just, I love some shows, and I was watching Criminal Minds, and one guy who had 2 strikes was innocent of the crime at the end. Obviously it's fictional, but is indicative of fears of a guy with 2 strikes, and they run the FBI barges in his house, and instead of risking going to jail for something that he could or could not have done, he decides to, shoot himself. These are things that we have to think about. 3 strike laws and felon voting rights, access to voting rights. The fact that, I've had there have been felons in my family that have fairly recently gotten the right to vote again. These types of things about when exactly does the sentence stop, or ideas like that, are things that we can discuss. And so some definitions and references here for you. The drug sentencing reform, the death penalty, also mandatory minimums. And so, I say earlier, abolishing a death penalty could possibly be a topical affirmative. Drug treatment programs, how we apply bail, what is considered to be excessive bail, what isn't. What about LWOPs and life without parole? There's a lot of evidence to suggest that a person who's been incarcerated, a couple decades, 3 decades, probably has changed so much over time that the person they were before they went into prison and the person that they were, assuming that they actually did commit the crime that they were accused of, is not the person that probably exists anymore, that they have changed and transformed over time to where they probably actually can be a very productive member of society. And also, why is it that we punish them after the sentence is over, i.e. you can't get jobs, it's impossible to do this, it's impossible to do that. And also, T is that actually sentencing. Parole applications and the way in which those are defined or applied. And so some mechanisms we can look at if you're the affirmative in terms of your plan text. I think that just saying, well, we will enact criminal justice reform, those sentence plan texts are probably trash. Because I think that specifically this year, having a specific mechanism, whether that's agent, attaching of funding, and if you're using funding, then that's probably Congress. What type of oversight? LOL, I forgot to close that parentheses. Excuse me. Ending legal protections, training. Do you want to decrease when police officers can use lethal force, have de-escalation training? What types of mechanisms do you plan to implement as the affirmative? If you're the affirmative, right, and you want to read plan list plan list F, and you're critical, go for it. I encourage it. I think that in spite of what I've said about enact and everything else, I think this topic is right. I can't stress it enough. No matter what your argumentation style, this is the type of topic where you can flex your muscles in whatever you read. There's a lot of evidence and a lot of ground roots activism about how people are fighting for change on just like a micro level and why that is working. And I know a lot of camps have written abolition on the app, and I'm not opposed to that. I don't think that is untopical. I think there's a debate to be had there, but I don't think that's necessarily bad to read abolition on the affirmative, because I think that teams that read abolition on the affirmative open themselves up to a certain type of argument that I think that could be compelling and introduces a very interesting type of debate that we've never had access to, that we'll get to on the negative video. But framework teams will be emboldened because of enacting reform. And so I think more so in past years, I think it's possible to read a planless app and say that you have a certain type of method in the debate round, but still say we'll defend material reform in the context of blah, 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 blah. I.e., we think our method is good to highlight or whatever blank ism, and we think that that's good and could possibly snowball into X type of change in the system. And while we don't necessarily think that putting our faith in the government is good, we think that our type of activism, i.e. micro-political movement or engagement, is good to snowball up to lead to some type of legislative or actionable reform or tangible change in the system. I think that there is a lot of ground to make those types of arguments as a K team. And I also think that that helps make your defense on those TUSFG framework debates a lot stronger. Because I think that if you still defend some type of material reform, i.e. you still get links to your disads, you still can you can read reform on the negative, right? I think that the fact that the topic is bidirectional inherently means that a lot of those arguments that might have been compelling about switch side debate in past years probably aren't as compelling, because just as easily as you can say enact legislation, the argument about switch side probably is more of an AF argument this year, especially with the bidirectionality. Switch side literally means you can read what you want when you want, because you are always literally switching sides. Like, it's not even a question of like which side of the debate. It could be, you could be on the AF having to defend reform good, but you could also possibly be on the negative having to defend reform good or reform bad, right? So I think that the switch side debate argument probably actually could lean AF this year, oddly enough. And so that's something to think about. And so some things that I want you all to think about, Arch City Defenders, that is a group in St. Louis. They help defend marginalized groups in the local criminal justice system. Black and Pink is a U.S. abolitionist group that helps supports LGBTQ and HIV positive prisoners. And there are a lot of things that the groups like them, the link here isolates, I think, 5 prominent Black women that are doing things in terms of criminal justice reform. The Sentencing Project is listed here, a DC-based research and advocacy group that works for decarceration in the U.S. to address racial disparities, right? So I think that there are a lot of avenues, if you are critical, to talk about, reference how your method that you defend is being implemented in the real world in these activist-type groups. And then you can read arguments about why your reading of the 1AC or your reading of the AF over the school year or at a specific tournament could lead to leading to some type of like broader understanding or consciousness or change. Some more calls for activism, grassroots activism you see here. And so I don't want to read to you all. I'm gonna open source this presentation. And so you'll have access to it so you can see and click the links yourself and kind of read for them yourself. And so some suggestions for viewing that I just kind of want to leave you with here at the end, the AF. And one thing that I don't want to, because we are coming to a close, and some of you may wonder, well, what about AF advantage areas? I'm not going to tell you how to read your AF, because there are a lot of ways to read the AF this year, and I missed another parentheses here on this slide. But there are a lot of ways to read your AF. And so I think that framing advantages, I've seen some cool advantages that get to like nuclear war, oddly enough. And, you know, there are also some arguments to be read about like separation of powers, depending on your mechanism. And so I think that over narrowing your research expectations, I think you should go where the evidence takes you. And so some suggestions for viewing, because I got rid of cable a year and a half ago. I straight streaming services for me. And so some areas where I think you all, How to Fix a Drug Scandal is awesome. If you haven't seen it, I highly suggest it. It's about 2 different crime labs in the state of Massachusetts. Oh my gosh, you need to see it. The Khalif Browder story is heartbreaking, gut-wrenching. It's another example. And one thing that I think everyone should be aware of when debating this topic is that this topic will over-invoke in some rounds the images of Black suffering and what I would reference as modern-day lynchings of Black folk, in an effort to drive home a point about what people are arguing. And so that's just one thing that I want to caution you all with. When They See Us is obviously a good one. Survivor's Guide to Prison, oh my God, scared the mess out of me. And these other ones, you know, I've seen, and this is obviously not a comprehensive guide. Children, if you were under the age of 17, 18, I highly advise you get parental consent before watching some of these. And if you want to think about one thing that I would suggest, if you can find your hands on Banging in the Rock. It was an HBO special that came out in the early to mid 90s, I think. It's about Little Rock, from where I am, Little Rock, Arkansas. And it talks about gang warfare and that kind of stuff. And so for those of you that are too young, now I was born in 88. I'm 32 years old at the time of this recording. And so those of you that are too young, it might be important for you to think about, why did the 94 crime bill, what led to it, what was the world like, what was the United States like? That is a good example of the way in which documentaries help sensationalize crime and the ways in which crime was affecting urban areas, and which begged for the tough law and order stance. And so with that concludes our intro to the topic. And so thank you.